Hey everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Raise podcast, where we get under the hood of founder scaling stories. Will and I are here today with Rob Gardner, CEO and co-founder at Rebalance Earth. Welcome to the podcast, Rob.
Hey, Alex. Hey, Will. Great to be on.
Good man. Thanks for taking the time. So in this sort of episode, we're going to focus around, can nature become an asset class, which was sort of brand new information to me when I first was connected with you and seeing on LinkedIn, but it's fascinating. So let's get into it. I guess what we would normally start with, Rob, is tell us a little bit about yourself and Rebalance Earth and what's the sort of problem you guys are solving.
Yeah. So this is my third business I've started, Rebalance Earth. My first business I started 20 years ago, Reddington, a pensions consultancy, and I started another business called Mallow Street. And really, I've spent over 25 years working in investment banking, pension consulting, and being an asset owner, and now an asset manager, investing in nature as if it was infrastructure. The thing that connects it all, though, is, at university, I studied geography and I specialized in glaciology and hydrology. So I kind of feel like 25 years later, I'm literally fusing my passion for geography, for nature and the environment and how it all interconnects with the discipline of finance, the present value of cash flows. How do you think about financing? How do you think about revenues? And that kind of brings us to where we are today with Rebalance Earth, which is really how do we deploy capital at scale to invest in nature restoration to deliver resilience in a play space somewhere in the UK, Oxfordshire, that delivers resilience to our energy systems, to our food systems, to our homes, our health, our transport and water. And if we can do that, then we can make money for our clients, restore nature and kind of make the UK more resilient to climate change and nature loss.
Fascinating. Okay. But you're doing better than me as well, by the way, because I'm about 25 years in and I've still not used my degree at any point. So you're doing better than I did. And then for people that are a bit unfamiliar with natural capital, what does that actually mean?
Yeah. So, there's a definition of natural capital that says that, nature provides what's called valuable ecosystem services. The most obvious being that it, provides us air that we can breathe, or clean water, or stores water, or the soil that grows our food. And you can come up with a sort of theoretical value of nature, which various economists have done over time. And famously, there was a report by Dasgupta a few years ago in the UK trying to put a value on that. But in a kind of more traditional financial sense, people have been investing in nature for years, but really as a commodity, right? Forestry being a prime example, we grow trees and then we cut them down for wood, for furniture, for construction. And then obviously all of agriculture, all of the food is, we literally grow our food and then harvest it. But that is by definition extractive. And we can think about how we do that. And increasingly there's a move away from a very industrialized forestry and agricultural model to a more regenerative one. And when it comes to pension funds who've invested in natural capital, they tend to start sustainable forestry, sustainable agriculture. At the far end of the spectrum is this idea that you restore nature and you leave it, and can you get paid cash flows for nature's ecosystem services? So how do you derive a rate of return without having to cut nature down? And that's really through payments for ecosystem services. And we do that at Rebalance Earth through a mixture of what we call resilience purchase agreements, which is a way that we can get a company to pay us for those services, flood mitigation being the most obvious. But also in the UK and around the world, we have various sort of credit mechanisms. So we have this thing called biodiversity net gain in the UK, which means when you build stuff, you need to add more nature. If you can't do it on site, you need to buy a unit. And then we also have these things called voluntary carbon markets, where companies have committed to net zero and they want to offset their carbon dioxide. And it's really those different payments, flood mitigation, drought mitigation, or water abstraction rights, clean water, biodiversity, and capital. Those form the revenue streams by which we pay back our investors over time.
Okay. And then that sounds like it would be quite hard to value financially. And maybe that's getting a bit easier just with modern technology. But historically, why has it been so difficult to sort of give a financial value to?
think it's because culturally we've always assumed it's free and taken it for granted. I think actually the financial bit of it isn't that hard. It's no harder than, how do you put a price on a 10 or 15-year power purchasing agreement? I know a lot of the people on your podcast tend to come from the energy space. This is no harder than, how do you price an offshore wind project in 2010? The hard thing is that for the last 200 years in Western society, post industrialization, we just kind of assume nature is for free. And we've not thought about the degradation of soil and its impact, not just on our food and our health, but also on flooding downstream. Obviously, we've sort of input a lot of carbon and changed our climate, but at the same time, we've completely changed our landscape. So in the UK, our landscapes, our peatlands are destroyed, our rivers have been straightened and canalized, our soil is of poor health. We've removed a lot of vegetation, which means that the landscape is literally degraded and can't store as much water as it once could. And then that means that when it does rain, it now flows off a lot quicker, and then it floods what's downstream, be it a road, be it a factory, be it a railway line. And increasingly, that has more and more costs, and therefore offsetting it has more and more value. The thing that I think has changed is that people are waking up to the reality that these sort of climate change and nature losses that people have been talking about 10 years ago are now happening here and now. Literally last week in London was a heat wave, but what people forget was last year at the beginning of Wimbledon was also a heat wave. These things are no longer episodic one-off things. They're kind of structurally locked in. And these literally then have a downstream impact on business and the economy. Last week, train lines weren't running, tube lines were all jammed up, people couldn't get to work. That has an economic cost. And so as that starts to happen more and more, we can price in the cost of that loss of availability, the destruction of infrastructure, train lines warping, roads, operations and maintenance costs going up. And once you have that, then all of a sudden you can start to price the value of mitigating and offsetting those risks.
Okay, that makes sense. I was going to ask you, why is it easier to finance a building than a river, which I think you sort of semi-answered, but is there anything else you would add into that? Because I think that's quite potentially a bit of a more complex, perhaps.
Yeah, so I often kind of describe a sort of river catchment as being, let's say, a bit like a shopping center. And so you want to restore all of it. So it's not just about having space for John Lewis and Boots to go in, but you need a good car park and you need other stuff. And in the same way that in order to finance it, you need anchor tenants. So typically you need the utilities in that catchment, the water utility, the road and rail utilities, the energy district network operators. They're, in my example, they're the John Lewis and the Boots that lock it in. And then there's a whole plethora of other businesses or the local authority or homes that sit underneath that. And then you can start to fill it in. So actually, one of the things that we're trying to do is use the templates and frameworks, I would say from the property industry and the infrastructure industry, the same methodologies that we used 20 years ago to build and extend our motorways or to build ports. And how do we apply those structuring financing mechanisms to nature? The thing that makes it harder is, unlike a sort of shopping center, which is sort of locked off, it's an entire river catchment and you have multiple agents. You've got farmers and landowners who need to change the way you use the land. And then you've got multiple beneficiaries down catchment and trying to align them. That's probably a little bit more complicated than my sort of shopping center analogy.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. Hard, but fascinating. So you talked there, Rob, about historically for 200 years, this kind of asset class has just been seen to be free, right? So in effect, you're trying to almost build a market that doesn't really exist yet or didn't exist, right? So how difficult is it kind of creating a completely new asset class?
Yeah, I would say there's probably three fundamental questions that need to be answered across four stakeholder groups. And let me caveat that I'm really talking about the UK here. This probably applies to sort of Western Europe and other countries as well. But one is recognizing and understanding that climate change and nature loss manifests itself in operational risk here and now, which manifests itself in material financial risk. And different companies in different parts of the UK are kind of like waking up to that. That's sort of part one. Part two is actually nature-based solutions, peatland restoration, river restoration, putting beavers in, restoring the soil health are highly effective ways of storing water, cleaning water, and effectively act as a mitigation and an offset to those risks. Think of it as a bit like, 10, 15 years ago, proving that, solar panel or offshore wind stacked up versus oil and gas for energy generation. So it needs to stack up on its own merits. And then the third thing is the financial structuring, like how do we get people to pay for that? And, we have contracts, voluntary carbon markets that have been around for a while. They've sort of faced challenges. The UK has been quite progressive in sort of mandating this concept called biodiversity net gain, which has actually been a great way to incentivize the restoration of nature in the UK as we build more stuff, not just homes, but all of our critical infrastructure. And then thirdly, one of the things that we're developing is resilience purchase agreements, but really we're just mirroring the power purchase agreements that were used to kind of catalyze the renewable energy market 15 years ago. So those are the sort of three questions. And then the four stakeholders are the companies, the water utilities, the transport utilities. People have factories or homes or assets of value in that catchment. Then it's the landowners, the farmers. In the UK, it's the big landowners, National Trust, the RSPBs, etc. Thirdly, then it's the investors, the pension funds. We're 25% owned by West Yorkshire Pension Fund. We attract money from both local government pension schemes and defined contribution pension schemes. So convincing the investors that this is a good way to make money. This is definitely for-profit investment. And then also getting the senior banks to also want to invest in the space in the same way that they invested in the renewable energy transition. And then fourth, the role of government, from Treasury to DEFRA to the Environment Agency to Ofwat and Ofgem. They are the enabling environment in the same way that they were 15 years ago for the energy transition to make it all happen. So that's my kind of 12 box grid that slowly for the last 3 years, we've been trying to turn all of those boxes green. And once you turn them all green, it then becomes a pretty obvious investable asset class.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned some of those are now sort of starting to come online and be, I guess, more receptive to that, right? So are there any, well, I guess, who are the sort of biggest believers and who sort of remain skeptical across those plethora of stakeholders?
Well, look, the pension fund industry, who I know the best, have been on this transition. I think the thing that sets aside pension funds from governments and corporates is they have a very long-term time horizon, right? If you're a pension fund trustee looking after your members' interests, the median age of your member is 41. You'll have members in there who are 20, and therefore, you're certainly thinking about the next 80 years. Typically, for a pension fund, you have an actuarial model out for 100, 120 years. So you when you think in decades, not years or quarters, you do think about the structural risks. And actually, as much as you're worried about short-term investment performance, you do start asking the fundamental question is like, will these businesses still be functioning in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time? And also, as you get bigger and bigger, you can't diversify away from this risk. There's this concept called being a universal asset owner. And for Norges, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, or for the Japanese government pension fund, they physically cannot diversify away from these systemic risks. We know now that these systemic risks to climate change and nature loss are significant. In the UK, we've had a national emergency briefing. In January, we had a joint commission from Defence and Intelligence Services saying the impact of biodiversity loss. The Institute of Actuaries, which is very important at influencing pension funds and how they think, have done repeated reports about these systemic risks. What takes time is to take these big headline risks and translate it into what does this mean for your portfolio, Alex and Will? You own shares in supermarkets, in fast-moving consumer goods. Like, how do I take these big, scary macro risks and translate them into bottom-up risk to your portfolio? And that transition mechanism has taken time. But the so what of that is that many UK pension funds have been analysing their portfolios. Scottish Widows did an analysis and found that water risk was the biggest risk in their portfolio, and then want to start doing stuff about it. And pension funds can do three things. They can engage with the company and saying, hey, well, what are you doing about these risks? 2, they can invest in stuff that provides resilience to that might hedge against it. And then they can also invest in stuff that actually acts as a bit of a hedge to changing climate and nature risks. And that's something that Cushion, a DC provider, has started to do. And so that journey has meant there is more and more interest in what we do and investing in natural capital, so much so that I think UK pension funds have committed they want to invest about 3% of their assets. That's that bit. On the corporate side, it's taken longer. Companies that have been public about this, like Network Rail and SSEN, they're on the front line of climate change. They've been experiencing these sort of flooding and droughts. People have been experiencing 1 in 30-year floods every year for the last 5 or 6 years. And once you realize that, you can start to go, well, hang on a minute. I get fined when this happens. I know what's happened to my operations and maintenance costs. I can make a pretty robust forecast about what my likely costs will be over the next 10, 15 years, and I need to do something about it. And more companies are also coming to the conclusion that sort of engineered concrete and steel isn't the answer. So the new thing has really been not convincing those companies about the risks, but convincing those companies that nature-based solutions and actually these whole catchment solutions can be a part of it. On the landowner side, again, we've had 50 years of farmers, I suppose, being sold the industrial farming complex of fertilizers and pesticides. And coming off that is hard. There's 3 movies, one's called Kiss the Ground, one's called Common Ground, and one's called Groundswell, which tracks the rise of sort of regenerative agriculture, but really means moving off not traditional, the kind of the consensus industrial farming complex of pesticides, fertilizers, moving to mixed cover crop rotation, focusing on soil carbon and soil health. And, the goal is to try and get, 1 billion acres moved to that by 2030. And again, more and more farmers are moving that way. And the movie Groundswell is literally named after a groundswell, which will be happening next week in the UK, which is where farmers share best practice on that. And then thirdly, government, right? Trying to get government policy to change is hard. But again, Ofwat, which is the water regulator, is really challenging the water utilities to think about how they use nature-based solutions as part of their £100 billion 5-year program to deliver better water outcomes, is encouraging water utilities to think about not just how they invest their capex, but this kind of idea of paying for outcomes. And then likewise, Ofgem, who regulates the energy industry, is also getting the energy industry to really understand what are the risks of their assets to climate and nature risks. But I think with all of these things, it starts with awareness. Then it's about understanding what those risks are and then putting a price on it. And then only then can you start to explore what that solution set looks like.
Yeah. I was about to ask you sort of what needs to happen before natural capital becomes mainstream, but I think you touched on that and sort of covered it fairly comprehensively. So it's interesting you're talking about those films. As you were talking about kind of adoption and people getting on board with it, it just kind of reminded, I can't remember when it came out, but it was a Netflix documentary about, I'm going to forget the name, but yeah, sort of beef and beef consumption, and everybody kind of got really into it. And I'm certainly not the only one that I think cut down, our beef, but back on it now. So it was short lived. But yeah, I mean, I think there is certainly a huge element of that where people just need to understand and sort of have the problem become a bit more visible in their day-to-day lives. And then it's tangible, right?
Yeah. At a local level, if we see where it's got the most traction is if you live in a community where there's significant flooding, and it's not going away, or you get whipsawed flooding drought, which is happening in many parts of the UK. We can argue about what's causing it and all the rest, but people want to get on with their lives and go, well, how do we fix this? Once the penny drops that this is the new normal, then it's like, well, let's get on with kind of preparing for that new future and adapting to it.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, so third business, third time, founding something. Do you think you underestimated how hard sort of market creation is compared to, say, product creation?
No, I think I went in with my eyes quite wide open, but it is a lot harder because you're right. My first business, Reddington, we were in effect coming into an established market. And so we were just trying to build a better version of what already existed. So we weren't creating a new market. There was already a market for pension consulting. The challenge is that we had to convince people that why was Reddington better than the incumbents? But we didn't have to convince people that they needed a pensions consultant for strategic asset allocation. My second business, which I co-founded again with Darren, that Mallet Street, that was creating a new market. We were effectively creating a social media like LinkedIn, but for pension fund trustees. And, back in sort of 2009, 2010, people thought social media was something their kids used. So that was creating more of a new market. But when I set off on this endeavor, I knew it was going to be hard. And kind of my business coach always says to me, Rob, is this a game worth playing, win, lose, or draw? And I think, the stakes of addressing this challenge is so big. I kind of wanted to be able to say to myself and my kids 10, 15 years from now, yeah, whatever happened, but at least I can say I gave it my best shot.
Yeah. Fair. I respect that. And then I want to sort of cover off a little bit about sort of, the making nature investable, because it's a really interesting space, I think. Creating financial value from environmental outcomes. How do you do that?
Yeah, well, as I say, like historically, money has either flowed to nature through philanthropy, so people feel bad and they want to sort of protect it. People have tried to create markets, the voluntary carbon markets being the one that's been around the longest, but as the word suggests, it's voluntary. And therefore, when times are tough, people will go, well, actually, maybe I don't need to buy my carbon credits. Where demand for carbon credits has been higher is where it becomes a compliance market. So, for example, the airline industry has a framework called CORSIA, which kind of mandates the airline industry now to kind of offset their emissions, and then that creates effectively a liability on the airlines, and then that creates demand. But I suppose this goes to the heart of business, which is there needs to be fundamental demand for those ecosystem services. In the UK, as I say, a few years ago, the UK rolled out a policy called biodiversity net gain, which means that any new development of property needs to end up with post the development, there's 10% more biodiversity than before. Either you do that on site. If you can't do that on site, you can buy a biodiversity net gain unit, which is quite a clever way of effectively, as you continue to build stuff, by definition, creating a net gain. But where we started was we wanted to make sure that there wasn't a lot of policy risk. And the danger with those markets is that they're set by policy and government, and we can see, governments come and go and policies change. And if we've got investors who are investing for 15 years with us, the risk of policy change over 15 years can be quite high. So what we wanted to do was find a reason that companies would pay for those ecosystem services on a fundamental basis, which is why we talk about positioning nature as infrastructure, as critical infrastructure. You're not going to turn your water bill off or your electricity, because we all need water and electricity to live our lives. So that's the definition of infrastructure. And so what was the biggest fundamental pain point in the UK that nature could be a solution to? And we really decided to focus on water, because in the UK, water risk is material, and it plays out in three ways. Flooding. By the way, flooding isn't just a winter phenomenon. Flooding can actually often be really bad after periods where we've had extremely dry. And then it rains, it can quite often flood, and that can cause quite a lot of damage. Drought and water abstraction, that's more subtle, because it's not like a flood where you suddenly see everywhere flooded and the damage. Drought is more subtle. There are parts of the UK where there just isn't enough water for homes and industry. And, imagine running a big business and suddenly the Environment Agency or the local water utility says, hey, Alex, we're turning your water off. That if you're a brewer, if you're, operating the chemical industry, that can be a big, big issue. And thirdly, the perennial issue in the UK has been water quality. Obviously, the water utilities get fined for that. The reasons why we end up pumping stuff into our rivers isn't because people are doing it on purpose. It's because our infrastructure was built 150 years ago for very different climatic conditions, for a very different population, for very different economic needs. We've kind of underinvested in them, and we kind of need to think differently about that. My point being is solving those three problems is a fundamental problem that regardless of your political view or whatever, solving those problems isn't going to go away. And therefore, the only thing that's different is that we need to prove that head to head, a nature-based solution is as good as or better than a cement or steel or an engineered solution, a water tank or building flood defenses in a town.
Okay. So then how is it you quantify something like, I don't know, flood prevention or drought resilience?
Yeah. So for an individual company, let's say like a railway operator, and, you can go on Network Rail's website and read their sort of climate adaptation reports. You need to be able to sort of take this kind of climate and nature risk. Let's take flooding. You need to turn that flood risk into an operational risk and say, when it floods, what does it cost Network Rail? Will they get fined for delays? And then on top of that, the damage causes their operations and maintenance costs to go up. So those are the kind of like, let's say, the two simplest operational risks. Now convert those operational risks into financial risks. Yeah, how much is that worth every year? Is that worth £1 million a year? Is that worth 5 million? Is it worth 10 million pounds? And then let's model that out for 10 or 15 years. And then let's maybe apply climate shocks and nature shocks and go, well, what might that look like if we're 1.5 degrees C above, our industrial average? What would it look like if we were 2 degrees C above? Let's stress test those cash flows. Again, standard sort of corporate finance, credit risk, actuarial analysis. 4, we now need to model those nature-based solutions and go, if we made these interventions, how much would that reduce that risk by? Would that reduce that risk by 50%? So, one of the things I point out is that 2 years ago, there were terrible floods in Valencia. It cost over 10 billion euros in damages. For about €1 billion over 5 years, if farmers changed the way they farm, you could have probably reduced the runoff and damage of that flood by 50%.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you have an equation that you can start doing. We can do the same here and go, okay, what is the value of that? Let's say we've reduced that risk. Let's say it was £100 million of cost that we think we can forecast over the next 10 years. Can we reduce that by 50%? So that's worth 5 million a year. Then how much shall I charge you, Alex, for that, reducing that risk by 5 million? Let's say 10% of that, let's say 500,000 a year. And then the question is, how do I contract for that? Well, actually, I can contract for that through a resilience purchase agreement in the same way that I do for a power purchase agreement. So if I can prove to you that in this river catchment, we can store this much water and I can reduce your risk by 50%, you'll pay me 500,000 a year. Then you're going to say to Will, your auditor and accountant, and go, how do I treat this contract in the same way that you manage your FX risk or your power risk? And then finally, you might go and speak to your credit rating agencies or your insurer and say, now I've done this, this should improve my credit rating risk because the impairment of my cash flows has decreased, and this should also reduce my insurance premium. That sort of 7-step process is how you go from the sort of big picture climate and nature risk down to a very specific way that we can do that. And the beauty of a sort of resilience purchase agreement, you can do it under the ISDA language, which is the language of derivatives, which gives a globally consistent language for contracting, but allows us to do something that's very bespoke and tailor-made for you, Alex. And then when I go and speak to Will, the water utility, I can use the same framework, the same principles, but Will's much more interested in water quality first. He's also interested in flood. And then the impact of those is different to Will's business, and I can tailor that contract for him. And then obviously the trick is that we need to do that, back to my shopping center analogy, many times. And then now all of a sudden we've built a financial model which allows pension funds to come in and invest the upfront capital. It allows companies to de-risk and pay for that risk transfer over time. And it allows the landowners to kind of get paid to affect that land use change and deliver the kind of climate and nature resilience that they need to deliver.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. You said earlier, it's not actually overly complicated. It's relatively simple. It's just getting the buy and all the rest of it. So, okay. And then you mentioned about, pensions allocating 3%, which is sizable, obviously. But what do you feel needs to happen sooner or immediately, ideally, for investors to allocate capital at scale?
Yeah, just to put it in context, our local government pension schemes that have now merged into these sort of 6 pools in England, they've got about £400 billion worth of capital. So 3% is £12 billion. Their job is to invest. They can invest that money anywhere in the world, in global equities, in US equities, in infrastructure and property in the UK and Europe. And obviously their job is they need to derive the best risk-adjusted return, but they also need to think about diversification and think about these risks to their portfolio. So firstly, they need to feel confident that investing in projects like this delivers them a healthy return. We're targeting a 10% return. It definitely is diversified versus global equities and US equities. Actually, it does provide portfolio resilience to the rest because they already own property and infrastructure in the UK. So that's an important point. The other thing is they need to be able to deploy capital at scale. As pension funds get consolidated and bigger, they need to be able to deploy bigger and bigger ticket sizes. And so trying to mirror the language of infrastructure and these kind of large public-private partnerships and do the same for landscape recovery is key. I think government plays a really important part in making that happen sort of quicker and faster. And again, there is a playbook that is well trodden, which is for, how did they get the offshore wind market? Well, actually recognize that development can be done through basically pension schemes and bank debt. what government can do is create policy certainty, and it can act as a sort of initial off-taker to create sort of revenue certainty. So in the same way it created contracts for difference that then allowed power purchasing agreements to come out on top. If the government acts as an off-taker for water quality, flood mitigation, drought mitigation, then that makes it crowds in other investors or other companies who go, oh, well, if the government buys into these, we can do in it. And then all of a sudden that creates a revenue stack. And once you have a revenue stack, that makes it easy for pension funds and banks to invest. And then like any business, it's about driving the unit economics so that the cost of deploying these things gets cheaper and cheaper. Your confidence in delivering them gets better and better. So you drive down the weighted average cost of capital. And again, this is exactly what happened with kind of offshore wind, right? That you have more confidence, capital can price it more cheaply, that cost of capital comes down, the unit economics of standing up a gigawatt of energy today is a lot less than 10 years ago, and we need to get to the same place for landscape recovery and delivering resilience at scale in the UK.
So then really natural capital could and perhaps should become as common an investment category as sort of infrastructure or real estate in the future.
Obviously I'm pitching my own book, but that's I do think that I think it should. I think if we were starting with a blank piece of paper, when you draw the boxes on the whiteboard, it looks the same. It's just that instead of building a building or an offshore wind farm, we're restoring peatland and landscape. And the trick is showing how it all clicks together. And actually what you want is a resilient landscape because that underpins the very properties and infrastructure that you're building. But yeah, that is where we want to get to. We want to create a scalable, repeatable, public-private partnership infrastructure model for landscape restoration at scale.
Excellent. Obviously, this is beyond the raise. I want to get into fundraising and sort of building credibility, right? So just talk us through sort of what your fundraising journey has looked like so far.
I think there's two aspects. There's fundraising in us as a business. So we're a fund manager, and so we need to raise money to build out the team and to give us a sort of financial runway until we get to break even and profitability. But the main job of a fund manager is to raise capital. We need to raise hundreds of millions of pounds and then deploy that capital and then generate the financial returns and the nature-based returns and the social returns that we've promised to our investors. I'm guessing like all of these things, you have different types of capital at different risk and return. So, Rebalance Earth started with two co-founders, Waleed and me, basically working for free, right? We start up with a business and it's good old fashioned sweat equity. Then 2 years ago, we did a small angel round, which got us to the next level. Then in September 2024, West Yorkshire Pension Fund invested in us as a fund manager. So they own 25% of us as a company, as well as kind of putting £25 million to cornerstone our first fund and to start proving our idea. And then, right now we're just extending our financial runway. So we've, gone back to existing investors. We've got a few other investors, but by now we've got FCA approved. We've deployed capital. We've proven we've hit a number of milestones. Now it's a question of how do you scale and how do you scale more quickly. On the institutional fundraise, we are launching our fund in Q4. We got FCA approval a few weeks ago. Just being a first-time fund manager, getting FCA approval, these are all big hurdles just to literally turn up to the race and be ready to race. We've been very fortunate that we've been backed by one of the UK's leading, they're called LTAF managers, but long-term asset funds. They make it easy for DC pension funds to invest. We've also got other local government pension schemes that are interested in our project. And interestingly, we've had investors across Europe, family offices, and specifically reach out and say, this is kind of the thing that we want to invest in. And so, hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have raised, £150 million. We're looking to kind of create an additional segregated bit on top so we can do these bigger deals. The idea is these landscape recovery projects require tens, if not, 50 million or more in equity to be invested. And then, hopefully then it's about sort of 2027 to 2030, really deploying capital at scale and restoring landscape at scale and proving that this can have the impact financially to our investors, but also to nature and society. But on that journey, you can see there's a very different risk and reward profile, right? And if you're a fund person investing in 2013 when we've done 5 or 6 of these landscape recovery projects, obviously the return on that investment is going to be lower than today.
Yeah, absolutely. And how difficult was it convincing investors to put capital into a category that maybe they haven't encountered before?
Extremely hard. I keep telling my colleagues that you need to get thick-skinned and get a lot of no's. I mean, this is my third time starting a business, and I suppose I'm sort of conditioned to no. Yeah, it's extremely hard, right? You need to find the right people who the capital, the interest, the risk appetite, the governance to be able to back you. And by the way, sometimes you speak to some of those people who are not right now, but they are interested and they want to sort of support you later on your journey. So, one of the things that I've learned is that you need to create different sort of types of capital with different risk and return for different points in time. And I think being really clear on understanding who is where and actually being really honest with yourself, I think can avoid running around trying to speak to lots of people and identify actually, well, I think you're perfect, but you're probably more a 2027 to 2028 investor. I'll keep you warm. And actually, you genuinely are interested, but you're just not ready to join now. Alex is keener to kind of not just think about the financial returns, but they also want to think about theory of change and catalytic change, and is ready to jump in now. And you need all of those types of investors to come together. The hard part is finding them, identifying them, and kind of curating them in the right order.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very difficult fundraising environment at the moment, and you only have to look at the news and see even the big guys are struggling. So, hats off to you. Not an easy gig at all. But within that, though, what sort of you talked about? It's difficult and trying to keep the team motivated as well. So, what signals kind of helped create confidence throughout that journey?
I think one is setting a very clear mission and theory of change, and then breaking that down into milestones. So, one of the things that we did, let's say going back to sort of 2 years ago, was said, in order to get this market going, these are 6 milestones that we think we need to deliver. And we're coming to the end of that period where we can go tick, tick, tick. We've managed to get companies to pay for nature because they want to and need to, not because they're told to. We've managed to deploy capital. We've managed to get other investors other than our initial West Yorkshire pension fund to invest. We managed to get FCA approval and launch our fund. We managed to build a team. We've got a team of 19 people. We've got a brilliant set of advisors. Actually, getting the right team and advisors adds a lot of credibility to your business. And then sort of getting the team and culture. And then just from a cultural perspective, we have these sort of 3 value sets. We call it hustle muscle, or basically GSD, get shit done, to kind of radical candor or locking horns, which is just, face the brutal facts. Well, you're not going to ready invest now. That's okay. This idea of with or without you energy. And then the third thing, and this is really important, is have fun. I think, we really try and make sure that the work we do is to have fun. And I don't want to be trite about that. It's just that we spend so much time of our time at work. It's extremely hard. And I think having fun gives you, I think if you marry purpose with fun, it sort of gives you without sounding a bit hokey pokey, it gives you that energy to kind of keep going, and it gives you that resilience to keep going.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's cliched to say it, but it is a marathon, not a sprint. So you've got to enjoy the journey along the way for sure.
Yeah.
You
totally.
talked about credibility there. How important is credibility, especially when you're creating something new?
Massively, right? I think, whether you're investing in us as a GP or whether you're investing in our fund, credibility is important. If you're a pension fund and you're going to invest 25 million in our fund, that's why we're a team of 19. We need, we've got people with expertise in private equity and infrastructure and in property. We've got the UK's leading river scientists. So kind of what we're doing hasn't been done before. So what we need to prove is that across our team of roughly 20, we've got the ingredients to make sense. Because at the end of the day, the people who are going to be investing in our fund are underwriting and going, does this team have the right group of individuals, and does it have the right culture to be able to do it? At the end of the day, when people were investing early in Rebalance Earth, obviously the key part, they're going to look at, my track record and credibility as someone who's built businesses, right? This is my 3rd time building a business. I'm in my sadly late 40s. No, I can no longer say my mid 40s, my late 40s, and so have seen the highs and lows of building business and what it takes to keep going and to course correct. to kind of make a business happen.
Okay, good stuff. When we first started talking, we had a chat about sort of AI productivity and sort of scaling teams perhaps a little bit differently, which is a thread I wanted to pull on a little bit more. And I think a lot of companies out there, especially sort of in that sort of startup scale up, obviously use AI, but for very simplistic, basic functionality, genuine, improving efficiencies in a bigger way. So you've taken quite a deliberate approach to AI internally, haven't you? So why is it you sort of decided to do that?
Yeah, I mean, when we set up 3 years ago, obviously AI was around, but not in the same way that it is today. Just a couple of things, we try and think really responsibly about AI. There's a lot of noise around how much energy they use and how much water they use. I think those things will change, certainly on the water side. I think, more and more data centers are becoming more and more water efficient, but nonetheless, we want to use it responsibly. And therefore, we need to be able to prove to ourselves that when we're using AI, it is giving us huge productivity gains. And so just culturally, we set this ambition of a team of 20 doing the work of 40 and the impact of 80. And if I look at the model, the financial model we built 2 years ago when we were fundraising, it was a traditional fund management model, whereas your funds under management grow, you grow your headcount, and it was pretty linear. I now think, and we now know we can do stuff that we couldn't do before, even 6 months ago, using AI. The other thing is last year, I think we were in exploratory, everyone was playing around with this stuff. Different tools, OpenAI, Claude, Copilot. And so at the end of last year, I asked my CTO, Waleed, to go, look, we're an FCA authorized company. That's extremely important. So, we need to think about those risks. We're not trying to be, a San Fran Anthropic startup, but within the constraints of a UK FCA registered fund manager, how can we be right on the bleeding edge of use and adoption? So we can't sort of cross that. So we want to operate within the FCA sandbox. We need to take data security very seriously. So let's look at data security models, various other things, and pick it. And so at the end of last year, we decided to go all in on Claude, and we rolled out Claude co-work across the firm. And the goal has been to move people off the sort of very vanilla chat onto co-work. Mm-hmm. And then there's a handful of our colleagues who are using Claude Code every day. I think that deliberate decision has meant that you get less of the ad hoc, everyone basically using their own favorite AI model at home and emailing it and all the rest. We've gone in. We have workshops every week, one-on-one tutorials, group sessions to really share best practice. And then we've just set ourselves the simple goal of can we qualitatively assess whether we're 5% more productive than we were a month before. And at the moment we've been doing that now. I mean, it's coming up to 6 months, and it's blown away by what we can do. Everything from marketing to finance through to building up financial models that sit underneath things to, putting out our new website. My head of marketing put out our new website and built that in Claude. So yeah, we've taken a very deliberate strategy to go all in. We work very closely with Landwehr, who provide all of our outside cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. We work with the FCA sandbox, and then also we treat cyber very seriously. So every quarter we have an away day. Every 6 weeks, so alternating, we have one day where we get together. And actually, we typically get together as a firm because we're only 20 people and try and solve a business problem together. Make it fun, interactive, but using Claude and building our own tools. But whenever we're together as a team face to face, we have at least half an hour on cyber and cyber risk, because typically the biggest risk on cyber isn't the technology; it's human. It's someone basically being socially hacked. So yeah. That's the sort of parameters in which we operate. And I have to say, I get FOMO because I listen to all the podcasts and hear about what people are doing. But then I also speak to other people in financial services, and they're stuck in Microsoft and Copilot, and we're a long way ahead. We're probably halfway between the two, but that's a log normal scale.
Yeah. And do you think that's possibly the mistakes that a lot of businesses are making right now with AI? Maybe not giving that cyber enough credit. It is really serious. Do you think businesses are making that mistake, or do you think they're making different mistakes?
I think it's different. I think, we're a startup, we're operating in private markets. If we get a data breach on oyster mortality rate, it's not going to move the market. We don't have 7 million members as customers. So I think, it's the advantage of being a startup where you can adopt a technology. I do think probably there will be some people who are adopting these things who don't take the sort of cyber risks seriously enough. I also think there will be some organizations that are so worried about the downside risks that they miss out on the upside risks. So I think this is a kind of classic risk return paradox where taking too much risk could be bad, but also not taking enough risk could be quite catastrophic to your business model over 2 or 3 years' time.
Totally agree, 100%. And then, okay, here's a question for you then. So in 5 years' time, do you think the best companies be the ones with the most people or the ones that are using AI the best?
The ones who use the AI the best. I mean, I mentor a lot of people in financial services who ask, should I be taking the CFA and all the rest? And I say, you should be, even if your company doesn't allow it in the evening, using Claude Cowork and, forcing yourself to use it, build it. The job of a company is to organize resources. Historically, that's been capital and people and maybe fixed assets, factories to make a product or a service. Now we've got this thing called intelligence and tokens on tap, and that needs to be added to the optimization process. So, look, I actually think in this world, the value of relationships, the valuing of meeting up face to face increases in value. The value of leadership and culture, it increases, and it's also about using intelligence. We're very want to reinforce the sort of human in, human out part of that piece. I think what AI is doing is just like it's tearing up all the rule books. So I don't want to pretend I know what the rule book is, but I think we want to sort of like be proactively in it, figuring it out. So for example, we've just signed up to one of the legal AI tools because we set ourselves the goal of like, as we grow, how do we not keep increasing our legal costs? Like, how do we flatline our legal costs? And there are lots of reasons why we could have waited, but we've taken the view that in the future, will legal AI be more prevalent or less prevalent? And if the answer is more prevalent, then we want to be an early adopter and figuring out how to use it quicker, faster, and better than our competitors.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, it's good, so good that you're just getting your hat in the ring. Like you say, the rule book, it feels like with AI, the rule book changes every 6 months anyway. What we're currently seeing and know, it's just not going to be the case even in 6 months' time, right? So, I think it's progress, not perfection in terms of exposure to it.
Definitely.
So you mentioned earlier, obviously you're able to do, or we all are now able to do so much more with so much less in terms of just pure resources, people ultimately, but yet you still need sort of that, I guess, critical mass, especially for you guys. You're kind of combining finance, technology, environmental science. How difficult is that talent mix, that skill set to build of the hires that you do need to make?
I think it's incredibly hard. What you need is kind of diversity of people and thinking. I mean, that's always the obvious thing to say, but the hard thing is when you have diverse people is like, how do you align it? And I think, as the CEO, you're that chief alignment officer. You need to set the long-term goals, but you've got the short-term, you've got burn rates, you've got cash flow, you've got revenue to make. I wake up in a cold sweat that I'm going to have a token bill that, I still remember as a student at uni with my first mobile phone and going like abroad and then coming back with a mobile phone bill. And I'm worried I'm going to get that AI token bill and feel sick in my stomach. I really think hard about how do we take everyone along on the AI journey within the firm and not just have a team of people who are all in it. And, one of my favorite movies is a movie called Hidden Figures, which is about these very talented mathematicians trying to put people into space. And they were called computers, and there was a room of computers, but they were all black women. And it's about when the IBM computer gets rolled out and she goes to the library and teaches herself Fortran, and she comes in and then teaches the whole room Fortran so they don't get disrupted by this IBM computer. And I feel a deep sense of responsibility to make sure everyone who works at Rebalance Earth knows how to use those tools. And it's not just 20% of people in the corner who love it and then go all in, and then everyone else doesn't know and then just goes and say, hey, well, how do I do this? I want to make sure that Alex and I know how to, maybe not do everything you can do, but we all feel pretty confident in using it.
Yeah. I mean, the rate of change as well, if you do allow that to happen, that gap is just going to become monumental so quickly.
Actually, it's all about rate of change. I think, culture is normally about managing the rate of change and adaptability of an organization. And I think we're just going like post-COVID with the like in work, out of work. And now with AI, that sort of cultural rate of change and managing it and aligning it, I don't think it's ever been harder.
What sort of talent for you then is hardest to find? And overarching that, do you now also add almost an additional skill set filter for AI? And is that something that you proactively hire for, or is that something that you can actually just train from within?
So I think the number one skill set is mindset. It's interesting. My daughter's just got into a really good netball thing, and they really map out two things. There's attitude. They give you an attitude score and an aptitude score. So the aptitude is how good are you at netball, and then the attitude is like, do you turn up on time with your uniform and all the rest. I think attitude is key, and mindset I think is increasingly the new thing. So far, we haven't been filtering for AI because I think we've only really been at this all in properly for 6 months. But I was thinking that in a year's time, when we come to hire people, I think there are good people that I might look at today or 6 months ago and think I'd probably hire them. But if they've been left behind on this AI journey, I don't think I might. I have been having exactly this thought and thinking, I wonder if that person doesn't pick that up, whether I'd hire them 12 months from now, especially the more senior.
I mean, that is fascinating, isn't it? But anybody listening to that, it's a signal right there to make sure that if you're not up to speed with it, it's just to get up to speed with it as soon as possible, because you're going to get left behind otherwise.
That's just a personal opinion. I
agree. I don't think that you're not going to be the only person thinking that. You're not going to be the only person that's hiring people and looking at that with that lens. It's just a fact.
Yeah. I mean, the age-old thing is you give someone a project, right, or a presentation, or you go and as an interview thing as it gets further down. I think in the future it's going to be an AI-based thing, and then if they've never done it before, that's going to be really hard. If they've been doing it, they'll be able to do it in half an hour. So you're just going to end up with like a really polarizing set of people.
Yeah, I think technical tests for AI will come into almost all jobs rather than just be like your classic engineering and that being the technical test. I think all jobs will move to this, which is just a even more reason why everyone's got to stick with the times, because as you get a little bit older and more mature in your career, you think, oh, what's this nonsense? I don't need to worry about that. But I think that's really shifted that completely. So it's critically important for sure. It's an interesting perspective. Well, look, sadly, I think we've just about run out of time. I think it would be great to sit down again in, sort of 9-12 months time and sort of see how things are progressing and understand even more about the AI and how that is going internally. But thank you for your time. Some really interesting conversation there. Really appreciate it and look forward to sitting down again soon.
Well, and thank you for having me on your podcast. I think, and well done for putting this podcast together and having the discussions you're having. It's so important. So yeah, I'd love to be back in next year to talk about the fundraise, what we've done, and where we are on our AI journey.
Thanks, Rob.
Cheers, Will. Cheers, Alex.
Cheers.